Welcome back to CTV News Channel. I'm Beverly Thompson. We want to look back at some of the top legal stories of 2018. From the courtrooms to the court of public opinion, these issues dominated the headlines all year, starting, of course, with the legalization of marijuana in Canada. CTV's legal analyst Ed Prutschi joins me now to talk about all of this. So legalization, recreational use, now all legal in this country, but there are still a lot of loose ends.
There's a ton of loose ends. I mean, for one thing, we don't know what the result of legalization is going to be. So everyone's very excited about Canada being sort of at the vanguard of this move, but a lot of people are wondering what's this going to mean for impaired driving being the primary question. Are we going to see over the holiday period a big uptick? Are we going to see in the new year an increase in accidents, fatal collisions, and things like that associated with the new legalization of cannabis? And from a lawyer's perspective, it's really exciting times for us because it's like going back to the 70s with impaired driving. We've got new machines, so we've got roadside tests that
questionable, some of them.
Well, exactly. They purport to be able to test saliva samples and give us a number as far as THC concentration. The science behind those numbers much less settled than it is in the alcohol context. So there's going to be a lot of litigation on the legality of applying these kinds of tests, the quality and the accuracy of these kinds of tests. And so you're going to see 2019, I think, will be a very big year for pushing back at some of the legislation and some of the consequences of the legalization of marijuana. The other big thing is the feds have really tossed all of this to provinces and municipalities. They set up a very skeletal framework and said, hey, provinces, and the provinces did the same to cities, you guys decide how this is going to get rolled out and implemented. So you really do have a patchwork across Canada where some provinces are saying the legal age will be 19, some want to say 21, some want to say you can open up as many stores as you want.
Where's going to be sold?
Exactly. Edibles versus inhales and vapes and all of these things. So it's going to take us at least a year, I think, to get into sort of a settled line where we can start to understand the interplay of all of these things in Canada.
Okay, so let's take a look now at convicted child killer terri-lynne back in an Ontario prison after a brief stint in an Indigenous healing lodge. Well, that sparked outrage across the country and toward the Liberal government. Originally, the government saying it wasn't really a ministerial issue, it was a Corrections Canada issue. Nonetheless, terri-lynne was taken out of that lodge.
Yeah, this was a very quick and very quiet turnaround because initially the response, well, first of all, across Canada, the response was horror. I mean,
like a lot of people didn't know what a healing lodge was.
I think very few people knew that these things existed. And for those people who did and everyone who found out, almost nobody thought that terri-lynne was the right person to put into an Indigenous healing lodge at this stage in her sentence and for what she ultimately was responsible for with respect to young Tory staffers. So there was huge anger. The Liberal pushback initially was, hey, we're government, we're politicians, we have no control over this. But lo and behold, within a week or two, they did have control over it, it appears, because pressure was exerted on Corrections Services Canada and an error or miscommunication or whatever you want to call it was reversed, and lo and behold, she's back in jail. And that was only worsened recently when we heard yet again with respect to the other person convicted in the Tory staffer case, Rafferty, who was moved from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison. And again, without the Stafford family really being notified or being given any opportunity to have input, discussion, or even just emotionally prepare for that move. So a series of embarrassments all arising from the same case, just demonstrating that from a communication standpoint with victims' families, Corrections Service Canada really ought to be taking a closer look at this. Someone's dropping the ball, and they've dropped it more than once.
Yeah, it's a lot of outrage, as you say, about this. And there was a lot of anger about this story as well. A jury acquitted Saskatchewan farmer Gerald Stanley of second-degree murder in the death of Colton Boushie, a 22-year-old Indigenous man. The family says the jury was stacked against them.
So if you're a criminal lawyer or anybody who's followed the criminal justice system, the trial itself was not all that outstanding. It was not all that precedential. It was not all that fascinating. It was a fairly run-of-the-mill, albeit in a very serious set of circumstances, a fairly run-of-the-mill question of self-defense and intent. So you had a farmer, rural community saying, look, it was late at night. This wasn't my intention. I thought I was responding to a robbery. I did what I had to do. From the strict perspective of the law, it was a fairly straightforward defense, and it turned entirely on its facts. It didn't set any new interesting precedent until the verdict was revealed. And it was at that point that, understandably, from the family's perspective, I have no concerns that a family says this is awful, the jury is stacked against us. That's how families feel all the time. I'm very sympathetic and empathetic to that. It was the response of our politicians that was really quite eye-opening and staggering. There was really a lot of interest among senior levels, the federal attorney general, the prime minister himself, to inject inject themselves in this and start opening up a conversation about, is the jury system working because of the result in this one instance? And we even saw legislation proposed, introduced, and potentially is going to pass that will remove some of the elements of this jury type of scenario and mess with the jury system and mess with the challenge for cause system specifically. And I think that has the opportunity to have really massive unintended consequences in 2019 and beyond.
Okay, so also this story, Marco Muzzo, convicted drunk driver. He killed 3 children and the children's grandfather. This was a crash in 2015. Up for parole this year. He, by the way, was sentenced to 10 years, so he's up for parole this year and was denied. Interesting, though, because of the reasons and what we learned about that process.
Yeah, so this was a story that just can't go away. I mean, I think a lot of us thought we had heard the last of Marco Muzzo, and certainly when the parole hearing came up, I was one of many legal talking heads who said this is going to be a walk in the park. I mean, here was a guy who, other than the fact that he had caused this horrendous crash and killed 4 people, I mean, the enormity of that is impossible to understate, but he had everything else going for him. And so when you look at the probability of being eligible for parole, getting that parole after 1/3 of his sentence, it was very, very high. Lo and behold, that was not the result. He got up there, he sounded very scripted, he pushed back, he got into very negative interactions with the parole board. The hearing ended up going an hour longer than it had even been scheduled for. And then we got sort of a reserved judgment, and a couple of hours later, the shock to, I think, a lot of people, certainly myself, denied.
Yeah.
And so now he's got to wait at least another year before he makes his application, if I'm not mistaken. And so we have not heard the last from Marco Muzzo. And whether he learns anything in the last year that he didn't learn in the first 3 is a good question.
Yeah, clearly the parole board saying you got to learn a lot more.
Well, and now I think he's behind the 8 ball because it's not as if they're able to say, well, you had 3 good years and, you know, there was just sort of a little slip up. I think the question is going to be, how could you have been so wrong? How could you have lacked so much insight into what it is that you did? And so he really has an uphill battle.
So an uphill battle for Bill Cosby as well.
Yeah.
or maybe there's no battle at all.
Well, his battle is probably over, although there are appeals still going on in the process. But Bill Cosby is so interesting.
So, and it is. He was sentenced to 3 to 10 years for sexually assaulting and drugging Canadian Andrea Constand. But this is the second time we've seen him in court for this.
And so I've referred to him as the bookends of the Me Too movement, because people forget, if we go back a couple of years when the first Cosby trial began, that was before Me Too was a hashtag and before we were all talking about it. Yes, there had been some other small trials, but this was the first big celebrity basically being alleged to have used their celebrity fame and to use that process and to abuse women on a systematic, ongoing basis. And the big question was, would celebrity trump the evidence in many respects, and would he be able to, quote unquote, get away with it? And seemingly at the end of a hung jury in a mistrial, it looked like that was going to be the case. Then you get a new trial about a year and change later, and boy, has the landscape changed.
Yeah.
I mean, now, you know, Me Too had permeated the social consciousness. Everybody knows what that hashtag means. We had seen people like Harvey Weinstein face charges. We had seen other convictions in less famous circumstances, and it really was a movement that brought people, you know, to the cover of Time magazine. And how impactful was that the second time around when another jury heard evidence again? Hard to say, but at the end of the day, Cosby's convicted, goes straight to jail. He's conducting his appeals, but he's certainly not in a good position as he was before.
Yeah, I know a lot of people saying if he didn't go behind bars, it would have been celebrity justice, they were saying. But how
exactly
then might this set either a precedent or affect future trials?
Well, you know, from a precedential perspective, it was not that unique a trial. Again, I mean, there were a lot of fundamental problems with it in terms of delay, in terms of evidence, the usual questions of bias and credibility and forensics. But what it seems to send a message is that it doesn't matter who you are. I mean, could you think of a bigger celebrity than Cosby, a person more closely...
The so-called father of America, right?
I mean, who's more closely associated with being just a good guy than Bill Cosby was? And yet that didn't matter at the end of the day. He was convicted. He is serving time in jail. And as you noted, the judge didn't even give him bail pending appeals. So they didn't say, well, you know, you can wait it out in one of your mansions while your lawyers file these documents. No, it was go directly to jail. So if you're a famous man on the other side of this equation and these accusations are coming, I think the status quo has very much changed, and Cosby marks the change in that status quo.
Ed Prutschi, thank you very much.
You're welcome.